Hi, folks. My name's JB Rainsberger. I'm very glad to be here. Unfortunately, this photo behind me is the closest I'm going to get to you this time around. So at least I have a little bit of a reminder of where I should be right now. But that's fine. Let's move forward. So my name is JB Rainsberger. I'm really happy to have the chance to chat with you today. My talk is called The Selfish Team Player. And for those of you who are maybe a little bit doubtful about what I mean by that and how nice it sounds, if you're a little put off by the idea of either selfish or team player, I promise I'll get to that in a moment. In the meantime, here's how you can get in touch with me. If you prefer LinkedIn or Twitter, you can visit my website, and the notes that accompany this talk are available from selfishteamplayer.jbrains.ca. So that's the only link you're going to need. For the rest of this, I hope is just going to be a nice conversation. And so that's, if you want to take a screen grab, do it now, or just jot down selfishteamplayer.jbrains.ca, and I'll put this back up as we get towards the end. All right. So I'd like to start by describing in a little bit more detail what I mean by selfish team player, because I can imagine that term might put a few people off. In fact, I chose selfish team player a little bit as a marketing ploy because I wanted something that sounded mildly controversial to be able to then talk about. And most people, when they heard about selfish team player for the first time, were worried both about selfish and about team player. So I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by that. When I mean selfish in something closer to the most productive, useful form of it. I don't mean that kind of childish selfishness of total egocentrism, but I mean that self-aware is not quite enough, but more what I think people have begun calling self-caring. It's that sort of rational self-interest that might be the only thing that an objectivist philosopher ever said that provided any value to humanity. The idea that ultimately, although we do want to be able to give ourselves and our time and money and energy to the people around us, we don't have infinite capacity to do that. And so we need to be self-aware and even a bit selfish at times in order to ensure that we keep our capacity up to be able to give to the people around us. And that also, so when we get to the term team player, I certainly do not mean the modern, I'm going to say maybe a bit unfairly, North American enterprise, typical, cynical concept of team player. I don't know how it is where you live, but where I live, still there is a little bit of, a little too much of the can-do attitude. And when you tell somebody that you don't know how to do something that they're asking you to do, their reply more often than not is, I believe in you, fully expecting you to do it anyway. And in that environment, team player ends up becoming a code for total self-sacrificing altruism for profit, which always made me uncomfortable. So when I say team player, that's not what I'm referring to. When I say team player, I am referring to team player in the most genuine sense. A person who, because of the trust that they have for the people around them, and because the trust they have for the context in which they're operating, their company, their team, their organization, their department, whatever that is, that they are willing to rise to the fifth level of Patrick Lencioni's teamwork and communication model. At the very top is attention to results, where you are willing to sacrifice, or to sacrifice is maybe the wrong word, where you're willing to put more emphasis on the results of the team, the organization, the company, than on your own. And so the selfish team player is an attempt to balance these two forces, because as you can imagine, selfishness has a tendency to push us towards locally optimizing, and in particular optimizing for ourselves, whereas being a team player puts pressure on us or prompts us to try to do what's best for the collective. And these two things seem in opposition with each other. I prefer to think of it that most people, most of the time, have tried so hard to give too much for the collective good, that they have damaged their own capacity to do that in a sustainable way. And that's what I want to talk about today. So the selfish team player is someone who helps themselves so that they can help others. And so this reminds me of one of those books that I read. Actually, I never read it. I listened to the audiobook. This was, by the way, an audiobook back in the days when to get an audiobook, you would walk the shop, peruse shelves, much the same way you used to do for video rental shops. And there would be books of cassettes, and you would then rent the cassettes, play them in your Walkman or in your boombox, listen to audiobooks that way, and then return them. So this was audible.com without the .com part. And back then, I think probably in the very late 90s or early 2000s, I don't remember exactly when, time management was the central craze in personal productivity. All through the 1980s and 1990s, there were books, entire bookshelves in bookstores about time management. And along came this book called The Power of Full Engagement, which had a very interesting title, and whose thesis was energy, not time, is the thing that you need to manage. And I won't try to repeat the entire book here today, but that was one of those books that came to me at a formative time and also sort of stood me up at attention. And one of the things that I got from this book was this idea of managing energy instead of time. Now, that doesn't mean don't manage time at all. That means managing energy is more important than managing time, right? While we value these, the things on the left, we value the things on the right more. So, and a little bit later, I read The Goal, which taught me about theory of constraints and bottleneck theory. And when one afternoon, I just remember thinking about these two things, and the two clicked in a way that really transformed the way that I look at my own participation in work and the work that I do for myself. And I came to conclude, understand, I'm not sure what the right verb is there, to really think of energy as the bottleneck. So for most of us, most of the time, energy is our bottleneck. And by the way, this is not a metaphor. This is literally true. If you think of yourself as a physical system inside the larger system of the universe around you, the amount of energy that you, your body, your brain can produce and sustain is your literal bottleneck. It limits your ability to do things in the world. And just to be sure that we're all on the same page, I want to spend just a couple of moments to talk a little bit about the basics of theory of constraints so that when I say bottleneck, we're all on the same page. So if you have read The Goal and you understand theory of constraints back to front, then you can take about a 60-second nap. I know it's getting towards the end of the day for you, so you might be ready for that. But the central idea in theory of constraints is the two central ideas are throughput accounting, which is a different way of measuring the value that comes out of a system, and the bottleneck. I'm not going to talk about throughput accounting. If you want to read about that, feel free. The Wikipedia entry on it's actually quite good. But bottleneck theory is the key point. Everything is a system, and everything is systems within systems within systems within systems. Your cells are systems, your body's a system, and the room that you're in is a system. The city that you live in is a system. There are social systems, mechanical systems, and so on. Everything's a system. And every system can be measured. We can measure the throughput of the system. Most systems are trying to produce something using raw material and some magic to turn that into results. And the flow, the rate at which it produces results, we can think of that as throughput. And so the bottleneck is the part of the system that limits the throughput of the system. Every system has a bottleneck. If it didn't have a bottleneck, then the throughput would be infinite. We would all be rich and everyone would go home. And since we're not all rich and not everyone can go home, then clearly every system has a bottleneck. And so that's really what lies at the center of theory of constraints. It's the idea that you measure throughput and every system has a bottleneck. That gives you a clear picture about how to proceed. If you want to improve the performance of a system, you'll probably get the best results by focusing your energy on the bottleneck and increasing the throughput through that part of the system. And if you do that long enough, then the bottleneck moves to another part of the system, and then you turn your attention there, and you keep doing it until the bottleneck is outside of the system that you can control. And then at that point, things get really interesting, and you start looking for ways to gain influence in the large system so that the bottleneck moves back inside the system, inside your sphere of control, so that you can, or influence, so that you can do something about it. All right, enough theory of constraints theory. Enough constraints theory. Good enough. The point here that I'm trying to make is that energy is a literal bottleneck for most people most of the time. I would dare say that energy is the bottleneck for everyone all the time, almost trivially. And so if bottleneck theory gives us a place to start and guides our thinking about how to improve things, then presumably we should focus our energy on improving. We should focus our thoughts, our attention on improving and managing our own personal energy. And that lies at the center of being the selfish team player. The difference between the selfish team player and the purely selfish is, what do you do with the increased energy that you create by changing your life, by changing the way you work, by changing the way you think, by changing the way you act? And the purely selfish person hoards all their extra energy and uses it for themselves. And the selfish team player reinvests or even gives freely some of that energy to the people around them. And that's the centerpiece of where I want to go today. So I remember a little over 10 years ago now, one of my good friends, Naresh Jain, who lives in India, he and I were both interested in this idea at the same time. And by coincidence, he invited me to go down to Bangalore and Mumbai to do a conference there, back in the days when international travel was still feasible. And we realized as we were leading up to the conference that we were both interested in this idea of using theory of constraints to coach teams. And so we joined forces and we ran a workshop about how to use theory of constraints to help guide coaching decisions in helping teams adopt agile working practices and principles and values. And I realized after that experience that we could use exactly the same principles to coach ourselves. And that's what I'd like to discuss for the rest of this afternoon, is essentially to give you some ideas of how you can use this idea of coaching using the theory of constraints in order to help you improve not only your performance yourself, but to improve how much of that productivity, performance you feel free to willingly give to the people around you at work. And by the way, obviously, you'll be able, well, maybe not obviously, but tangentially, or as a nice side effect, you'll be able to use that even in your personal life as well. So thinking about the work of software people for a moment, they're essentially, and I'm going to think primarily from the point of view of the programmer, because I grew up as a programmer. That's how I got into the software industry, even though I don't write code full time for money these days. I still feel like I'm a programmer at heart, and I'm even a programmer in the way that I think. My view of the world tends to be a little more rational than maybe it ought to be. And I have this sort of very typical introverted, mildly socially awkward or socially unaware mindset. That's sort of where I came from. And so I tend to think of this from the point of view of the programmer. So if you're not a programmer, I apologize. And for the ones of you who are, I hope this will hit home a little bit better. But the three main areas to work on as a programmer are writing the code, organizing the work, and navigating the people. And as I say that out loud, it occurs to me that writing the code is not really an interesting part of the discussion. I mean, I'm going to stay there because it's a little bit more concrete that way. But if you are a technician and your technical work isn't writing code, but it's some other kind of technical work, something that requires technique, it doesn't have to be, building software, then you can think of that first category as the technical work that you do as a programmer, as a tester, as a project manager, as a people manager, as someone involved in marketing and sales, as a writer, whatever that might be. But the three main areas are doing your technical work, organizing your work, and navigating the people around you. And programmers in particular have the habit of focusing all their time and attention on the first of these and just sort of picking up whatever they might happen to pick up along the way in the other two. They focus their energy on how to write the code. And that's, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but I'm saying that that takes rather a limited view. And if you only focus, as a programmer in particular, if you only focus on writing the code, on testing and design and all those wonderful things, then most programmers that I work with and that I've coached find that when they focus on that alone, they use a lot of their energy, but they find themselves hurtling. Well, not always hurtling. Sometimes it's hurtling towards, and sometimes it's walking moderately but steadily towards periods of burnout and depression. Any of us who have worked as a programmer in particular, but also as a tester or as any other sort of frontline software producing people, you know, the so-called feature factory, not that I like that metaphor, we've all experienced periods of intense production. And not the intense production that comes from spark of inspiration that creates enough energy to carry us through, you know, several sleepless nights in a row where we have to get this idea out of our head, but the more plodding, relentless, externally driven death march style of work. I hope it's becoming less common than it was 20 years ago when I first entered the field, but I fear it's not nearly as rare as it could be. And when focusing on the technical part of your work, so for programmers, when focusing on things like design, testing, and learning technology details, putting things together and making them work, they have a tendency to spend a lot of energy on solving deep problems and sometimes doing painful, tedious work and expressing frustration at things not behaving correctly and all those things, without putting attention on how to renew their own reserves of energy. So what ends up happening is that, you know, the long arc of their work almost invariably turns towards burnout and depression. And it's really just a question of how intensely, how severely, and when it happens. And I wouldn't be talking to you about this topic if that hadn't happened to me. It took me well over a decade of working with burnout and some moderate to severe depression symptoms to even be able to write an article such as Productivity for the Depressed, which is one of the blog posts that those of you who are suffering from burnout and depression symptoms might find helpful in your time of need. And so focusing on, I mean, there are some things that we can do in our technical work to help us, but we have a tendency to combine, or many programmers have a tendency to produce as much code as they can, not think too much about how to organize their work, and not think too much about how to change the way they interact with people. And the result is a severe energy drain that just leads them towards burnout and depression. It's just a matter of time. And so what I'd like to do today is to highlight a handful of practices that, if you're not using them, might be helpful to you in managing this situation better. And all what these practices all have in common is that they are, in addition to being productivity techniques, the kinds of things that creates better results that are more useful for earning more profit and for getting praise from your managers, or for, you know, making the investors of your employer's company 0.034% richer. More than anything else, I mean, I teach these things so that the companies who hire me get better financial results. But ultimately, what I care about most is in helping individual people use these techniques to deal with the bottlenecks, the specific bottlenecks related to their energy. And the central idea is that if you use these techniques to work with more joy, less stress, and to sustain your energy or even recover your energy better, then not only will you be able to produce better results yourself, but you'll have more slack, you'll have more freedom to give that to the people around you. And once you're able to do that and sustain your energy enough to be able to give it to the people around you, then your collective results can only get better. And that is, I think, part of what Patrick Lencioni meant when he talked about, he once wrote that teamwork remains the business world's biggest untapped competitive advantage. And he wrote those words probably close to 20 years ago by now, and I don't think that's changed. And in fact, if you look around you, probably you don't think it's changed either. So let's now I'd like to talk about some specific practices. And the first one, that it won't surprise you at all, is evolutionary design. Now, some of you who know me and who know my work probably expected me to say test-driven development. One of the things that I've realized over the years is that, like every other programmer who focuses too much on implementation details, my focus on test-driven development is a little bit misplaced. What really interests me here is evolutionary design. The idea of evolving the design of the system in a way that allows me to defer decisions until I have more information with which to make them while still making progress now. The part of the evolutionary design is essentially a technique for designing software systems that allows us greater flexibility in how we choose to build it, while limiting the amount of upfront investment we make in things that we might not need later. And test-driven development is just one way to do it. Now, I happen to think test-driven development is a safe, effective way to do it. I might even be willing to say that learning test-driven development, the act of building the habit of doing test-driven development, might even be necessary to do evolutionary design effectively and safely. But I'm very nervous about making that a universal statement. So let me say it this way. I believe that most people, most of the time, if they want to do evolutionary design safely, if they want to feel comfortable, confident, and to effectively evolve the designs of systems, to give themselves the freedom to defer decisions until they have more information, to give them the freedom to make progress without locking them into too many decisions that limit their decisions later, to do evolutionary design and to do it well, you almost certainly have to have learned test-driven development. And those who have practiced test-driven development for a year or two or three are probably in that stage where they could never imagine writing code any other way. They could never imagine changing the design of systems any other way. That without having the freedom to refactor as you go, and without having the confidence of tests to make that refactoring safe, they would never be willing to do evolutionary design otherwise. And the only alternative would be to go back to the bad old days of sitting in a dark corner for 4 months, thinking really hard, drawing lots of diagrams, and then hoping they got it right. I would say that now, after, say, a decade or so of practicing test-driven development, the habits that built, the habits that people build when they practice test-driven development long enough, and I'm just using a decade as a placeholder, it doesn't have to be 10 years. This isn't a restatement of the 10,000 hour rule. Eventually, as you practice test-driven development long enough, as the habits become deeply ingrained enough, as it gets under the fingers the way a pianist would think about it, the way that you think about design changes sufficiently, and the impulses towards discipline, the impulses towards working carefully when you need it, become so deep and so effective that you could absolutely do a non-trivial amount of evolutionary design without tests and probably be okay. That might be a surprising thing to hear from me, but I think it's true. I don't practice test-driven development nearly as strictly as I did the first 3 or 4 years that I learned, because in a sense, I'm writing some of those tests in my head. So that's one part of it. Some of the habits and the patterns that I've learned deeply, I understand them so well that I can just do them, and I don't have to feel like I absolutely need automated tests to protect me every step of the way. So that's part of it, right? It's reminiscent of what we used to say about extreme programming way back in the old days, that extreme programming isn't following the 12 practices, but extreme programming is the set of impulses you have and the discipline that you build and the things that you do, even if you don't practice. So once you've learned the practices and practiced them, and let's, for the sake of brevity, use the phrase mastered the practices, when you can do all 12 of the XP practices in your sleep, whatever it is that you do to actually build something, to deliver features, to do any kind of work, is extreme programming. It's the set of impulses that you have. It's the way that you define doing the right thing or doing work well after you've mastered the practices. And maybe even more importantly than that, it's remembering, it's having the impulse that in a moment of uncertainty, in a moment of stress, in a moment of panic, in a moment where things are going wrong, the fact that you then have the impulse to go back and write a test or deliver more frequently or commit more frequently or have more conversations with the customer, that set of impulses to me is what matters most. Not that you follow those rules forever, but that you are prepared to follow those rules at the moment when you need them most. And so to bring that back to evolutionary design, I trust myself, no surprise, to do evolutionary design without tests in a wide variety of situations, because I know that if I make a mistake, then my immediate impulse will be to write some tests. And if I start feeling a little bit nervous, if I start feeling a little bit uncertain, if I notice my confidence level decreasing while I'm trying to build something, my first impulse will be to write a test. And that impulse, to me, is the important part of having practice test-driven development in evolutionary design. So even if you set aside all the other practical benefits of evolutionary design, deferring decisions, following YAGNI, having a suite of tests that you can run that gives you confidence that you can change the code without making too much of a mistake, the extra feedback that it gives you, the flexibility that it gives you, the confidence that it gives you. For me, what really matters ultimately is not first, let me say, first, that I feel less stress when I write code. And second, when I do feel stress while writing code, I know what to do to relieve the stress. And writing a test, or writing the code more incrementally and refactoring towards a generalized solution becomes the impulse that lowers my heart rate and makes me feel better. In fact, here's a conference session that I've been wanting to do for 10 years, and every year that I think about it, it becomes more feasible. Take 6 experienced test-driven development practitioners on 2 different teams, so 6 each. Put them in a room, hook them up to heart rate monitors, put the heart rate monitor readouts on the screen, and ask them to build something. And one team gets to practice test-driven development, and the other team is not allowed to write tests, and monitor their heart rate as they build features. And what I imagine I will see is that the side that writes tests, every time they see a green bar, somebody's heart rate will decrease. They will recover energy in between bouts of writing code. In fact, this is exactly what the authors of The Powerful Engagement saw when they compared the training regimens and the performance of the top 20 tennis players in the world and the remaining of the top 200. The top 20 players in the world weren't uniformly better tacticians. They weren't uniformly more fit. They weren't uniformly better shot makers. There were plenty of players in the top 200 who had forehands or backhands or could make lob shots that were better than the players in the top 20. But the players in the top 20 knew how to conserve their energy in between points. They dropped their heart rate 15 beats per minute more than the other players did, which essentially meant that they were conserving energy to use later in the match. And that's why if you look at especially men's tennis matches, because they tend to play 5 sets, if you look at the first 2 rounds of major professional tennis tournaments, it's very common to see matches between top-ranked players and bottom-ranked players out of those 64 taking part. The bottom-ranked player wins 2 out of the first 3 sets, and then the top-ranked player just destroys the lower-ranked player in the 4th and 5th set to win the match. Because the top-ranked player, they are equally good players, but the top-ranked player knows how to manage their energy better. And that's what I think we do when we practice test-driven development, when we practice evolutionary design. It's a way for us to manage our stress levels as we're trying to figure out how to make things work and how to connect them together and how to reduce the overall and ongoing costs of adding the next feature. So that's why I think practicing evolutionary design is helpful for programmers. That, for me, is the primary reason. And so if you want to learn test-driven development and you're not sure if it's going to be of value to you, I encourage you to learn it because it'll be a way for you to manage your stress level and keep your energy up. Now, I want to talk about a couple more topics here. I should probably double check how much time I have left. So if somebody could let me know in the chat window, double check for me how much time I have left, then I will adjust accordingly. The other two main areas here are organizing the work and navigating the people. And these are extremely complex issues, and I certainly cannot cover them in detail in 5 or 10 minutes. What I'd like to do is to give you some places to start so that if you are lost, if you're like me and weren't the kind of person who sought these ideas out for themselves, who needed somebody to introduce them to them, then I hope that's what I'm going to be able to do for you today. So regarding organizing the work, there are essentially two basic levels of organizing the work. There's the personal productivity part of it, the personal organization part of it, and then there's organizing the work as a team. And I find that if individuals do not have good systems for organizing and monitoring their own work, then they find it not only difficult, but almost counterproductive to then try to coordinate their work with the people around them. It is extremely difficult to it's extremely difficult for most people to be attentive to organizing the group's work if the individual people feel like their individual workload is entirely out of control. And in fact, if your personal workload is out of control, you don't even know how much capacity you can bring to the team, to the project, to be able to then plan effectively. And what ends up happening is this manifests quite often in battles during iteration planning, monthly planning, quarterly planning, within the team and between the team and the rest of the organization. It becomes very difficult then. If I don't know what my personal capacity is, then I have no idea how much we can do as a group, nor do I really know how much I can, like what to do in order to improve the capacity of the group. And teams tend to struggle with this a lot. And when they struggle, they feel stress. And when they feel stress, individuals have a tendency towards a defensive posture in which they try to protect their own individual capacity because they have the mistaken impression that if they produce the most they possibly can, then that will be what's best for the rest of the group. So there are a few things that can help here. One of them is an understanding of theory of constraints. An understanding of theory of constraints and bottleneck theory will help us as individuals understand that optimizing our own individual performance is not necessarily what is going to help. And actually, let me be clear. I said performance there. I meant production. And the difference is really important here. Instead of continuing with the mistaken belief that maximizing our individual production, we don't want to persist in the delusion that this is what's best for the production of the team, of the group, of the system around us. Now, if you understand theory of constraints and bottleneck theory, then that's already fairly obvious to you. But what might be a little less obvious is that, on the contrary, focusing on increasing your capacity to produce is less likely to result in the kinds of inventory producing bottlenecks that hurt the production of the entire team. In other words, you've probably heard it said that the theory of constraints says that we should never try to improve the system away from the bottleneck, that's always a waste of time, that any investment we make in trying to increase throughput through a non-bottleneck part of the system is total waste. The is total waste part makes me very nervous, because although focusing on a non-bottleneck part of the system, a part that has spare capacity, although focusing on that part indeed doesn't increase the throughput of the larger system, that doesn't mean that improving a non-bottleneck part of the system is always wasteful. So here's what I mean. Some systems are in such disarray, some teams, some projects, some companies, some departments are in such disarray, their productivity level, their production level is like 5 or 10% of their available capacity. So you can do this by measuring value streams. And if you do this, what you end up finding out is that most groups have a tremendous amount of spare capacity. What that means is that I can justify spending time working on a non-bottleneck part of the system, for example, my own energy, as long as the resources that I use to do that, the time, the other people, the attention, maybe the money, as long as I'm not producing excess inventory, and as long as I'm not distracted from doing something that I could be working on the bottleneck. So in other words, if improving the bottleneck is outside my immediate sphere of influence, and it often is, and if my act of improving my own work doesn't steal resources, doesn't produce excess inventory that gets in the way of other people's work, then I can spend that time focusing on myself, and I'm increasing my capacity to deliver more value later and not making the situation around me worse. What that means is then I can justify spending time improving or reorganizing my own work as long as it doesn't result in me either doing that in place of actually improving the bottleneck. Improving the bottleneck might be outside my sphere of influence. It might be something that my team lead needs to do, or that my project manager needs to do, or that my personnel manager needs to do. Or I might not know enough about the organization around me in order to be able to competently try to improve the throughput at the bottleneck. And so what should I do with my time? If I can then justify spending time learning how to improve my own practice, organize my own work better, and not worry that that is making the system worse, not worry that that is contributing to the local optimization problem that we typically have in theory of constraints. So what can I do to get started? One of the simplest things that I can do is to adopt some practices from an overall technique called getting things done. Now, very important. I do not want to turn this into a getting things done symposium, and I certainly do not want to turn this into a getting things done cult meeting. Personal productivity techniques are the kinds of things that many people have a tendency to kind of turn them into a little bit of a religion, and that's definitely not what I want to do. By the same token, just like I think test-driven development is a good way to do evolutionary design, I think getting things done is, on average, for most people, most of the time, a pretty good way to learn how to start better managing our own work. And the nice thing about using techniques from getting things done, there are two things that I like about it. One, you don't have to do all of it to get the benefits. And two, you don't need anybody else's permission to get started. In fact, one of the simplest things that you can do is to use the so-called inbox technique. And the inbox technique is essentially a way of managing distractions while you're working. And it's very simple. We've all had the experience while trying to do work, while trying to focus on a task, of being distracted by things going on around us. It could be other people asking us questions. It could be emails popping up, Slack notifications. It could be remembering that there's something that you need to do this afternoon. It could be looking at the code and realizing, oh, I thought I was only going to have to do these 3 things, but I actually have to do these 7 things. And from all these distractions, what you have are you have not only distractions from the current task that you're trying to work on, but you also have the difficulty of trying to simultaneously do a thing and think about doing a thing. And it's very hard to both think about doing a thing and do a thing at the same time. In fact, if we want to get all Buddhist about it, it's impossible to think about doing a thing and do the thing at the same time, because if you're thinking about doing the thing, that you're not doing the thing. It's as much Buddhism as we're going to have. Well, no, we're going to have a little bit more Buddhism later, but I promise not too much. So The inbox technique consists of managing these distractions by having something as simple as, say, sticky notes or index cards if you're a hipster like me, or a notebook, and being able to write those distractions down as they come up. The technique is simple. Figure out the task that you want to focus on. Try to focus on it. And as things come to your mind, email notifications, Slack notifications, somebody asks you a question, somebody interrupts you, an idea comes to your mind, you remember something you need to do later, you remember something that you need to do soon. When any of those things happen, write it down. It sounds simple and it works. Just write it down. You don't have to write it down in detail. You just have to write down enough words so that you can quickly get that out of your head and get back to the thing that you're focusing on. And writing it down is helpful, whether it's something you just remembered that you need to do next week or something that you are pretty sure you're going to do in 20 minutes. It doesn't matter the time scale. The idea is to write these things down to get them out of your head so that you can get back to focusing on the current task. And if you do this, and if you practice it diligently, then a couple of wonderful things will happen. The first wonderful thing is you will notice that you feel less anxious about what you're doing as you're doing it. Just the cost of the distractions is reduced. And the second thing that you'll notice is that by being able to focus on the task more, you'll be able to finish your tasks sooner because you'll make fewer mistakes and you'll be more confident about the results. And if you're lucky, after a few months, something wonderful will happen, like one of my experiences, the experience that made me realize that this inbox technique was really helping. And it was the first time that I sat down, did some work, was diligently writing things down in my inbox as they came to me. And then at some point, I looked at the task and I said, yeah, I think I'm done. So then I looked over at my inbox and I scanned the list of things that I'd written down, and I noticed something in my inbox, a little task that made me go, oh no, I forgot to do that. I had one of those moments where I thought I was done with my task, but it turned out there was one thing I forgot. Good news, everyone. Not only did my inbox help me not forget to do that little task, but during the hour and a half between when I thought of that task and when I realized that I hadn't done it yet, I hadn't wasted any conscious energy on remembering to do that task. What that allowed me to do not only was to focus on the things that I was doing, but also it allowed me to build confidence that if I get things out of my head, I will have an opportunity to look at that list and not to forget to do those things. The inbox technique gave me the confidence. It helped me develop the confidence to get things out of my head to focus without anxiety or concern about forgetting something important. More often than not, what happens is that when I take a pause from the task that I'm focusing on and I scan through my inbox, I cross out a bunch of things that I thought I needed to do but didn't need to do. And then there's one or two things that I need to do now, so then I finish them up, and then the rest go into my plan. And then you can use the other techniques from getting things done, projects and next action lists and ticklers and all the other parts of the book to help you manage the things that you don't have to worry about or the things that you're not managing in the middle of a working session. And so if you combine this inbox technique with something like monotasking or Pomodoro technique or any of these other work in short burst tricks, what they give you, if you practice them, is a wonderful balance between being able to stay focused on the task that you're working on without the risk of forgetting things that might come to you while you're working on them. The things that you need to do will not slip through the cracks nearly as much as they used to, but at the same time, you're not distracted by remembering to do all those things all the time. So you can start with the inbox technique now. It doesn't require anything more than something to write on, something to write with, and the impulse that when a thought comes to your head that's not the thing that you're doing now, write it down. And as long as you do that, that's already getting a lot of the benefit from getting things done. And the reduced stress that you feel, the reduced anxiety, the increased ease that you feel from that, you will then be able to reinvest that either in learning more about the techniques and about how to organize your work in a more overall way, or you even just might notice that you have more energy towards the end of the day to be able to do that extra task, to be able to help somebody else out, to be able to give that energy back to your project, your team, your family. You might even notice that when you stop working at the end of the day, that both you feel comfortable to stop working because you've written stuff down and you can get to it tomorrow, and that you can leave work at work, even if for now work is just the next room, and focus more on being with your family, with yourself, with your community when you're not working. I should say when you're not at your job, even though for us right now, being at your job might just be walking into the next room. So you can start learning and applying the ideas from Getting Things Done to organize your own work. The benefits that the outside world will see, that your team, your employer, your manager will see, is better results, getting things done sooner, not faster, but sooner, making fewer mistakes, doing less rework, and being generally more predictable in how you produce results. But what I hope you will feel more than anything else is more ease, less distraction, less stress, less of a feeling of exhaustion towards the end of the day, the ability to sustain the pace, not because I want you to be able to work longer hours, but because I want you to be able to feel the same, more or less the same energy when you decide to stop working as you felt when you decided to start working. So that when you walk away from work for the day, whatever it is that you do in the rest of your life, that you can give those parts of your life the same focus and attention that you give to your work. So that's how you can use Getting Things Done. You can use the inbox technique as a way to start doing Getting Things Done. I also have an article called Getting Started with Getting Things Done. If you give a 300-page book to somebody who already has too much to do, then they usually throw the book right back at you. But if you give them like a 5-page document that they can read in 5 or 10 minutes, that might give them a chance to get started. And so between my article, Getting Started with Getting Things Done, and just this inbox technique that I've described with you, you already have enough tools to get started trying to use Getting Things Done in your real work. So the other thing that I want to talk about, the other main area that I want to talk about, is navigating the people. So this is an area that is significantly more personal and significantly more emotional. And it is by far, I mean, if you know the work of Jerry Weinberg, then you're familiar with the idea that, everything is the problems are always a people problem, and everything's a people problem. No matter what's going wrong at work, among the team, among the group, among the department, no matter whether people are or what people are complaining about, the root of the problem is always a people problem. And navigating the people is one of those things that, sadly, the stereotypical programmer doesn't get a lot of training in doing. Let's put it that way. I'll take the extreme case of someone like me. I am not one of those kids who grew up magically understanding how to play well with others. I was the very typical introverted, hyper-rational young kid. I also happened to be, happened to have some extra cognitive capacity, which just is a way of trying to say that I was a know-it-all and not mature enough to understand what effect that had on others. You put those things together, and what you usually get is a socially awkward, shy, moody, lone wolf programmer. I had to learn in my early 20s that had been the bottleneck in my development of my career. And I needed somebody to teach me how to play well with others. And it's kind of true what they say, that everything you needed to know, you learned in kindergarten. But for those of you who didn't master those lessons by the age of, say, 8, good news, you can learn these things in adulthood, and it doesn't have to be too painful. One of the ways that you can start the two main things that I want to talk about or mention, not talk about in detail, one of them is called the Citerior interaction model. That's named for Virginia Citerior, who's a family therapist whose work has also been adapted to use in organizational dynamics, which is one of those topics that I resisted for a long time because the people that I saw online promoting nonviolent communication in my circles seemed to me to be awfully violent communicators. And so I sort of resisted it as cultish nonsense for a long time. And finally, last year, I let it into my life and actually have found it to be quite beneficial. And the two go well together. I want to highlight just a very tiny bit of both and encourage you to look when you walk away, I guess, when you turn your machines off today. The Citerior interaction model is a way for programmers especially, but also for people who tend to think in sort of the somewhat rational, hyper-rational mindset of the average programmer or the stereotypical programmer. I like to think of it as a way of debugging bad interactions. And so that's what appealed to me as a programmer, was that it was a model for debugging bad interactions. I could get into a fight with somebody, and then when it was over, get myself out of the situation, go into the corner, sit down with a bottle of wine, cry a little bit, and then wonder what the hell happened. And the Citerior interaction model gave me a way to make sense of what happened so that I could try to either repair the relationship or improve my behavior next time. Now, I don't want to describe the model in full detail. You can do that easily by reading a couple of articles on the topic. Some of them might even be my articles. It doesn't matter whose you read. The important thing for me about understanding the Citerior interaction model is the single biggest mistake that inexperienced communicators make when they interact with other people. So the model consists of 4 stages in its simplest form. The last 2 stages, I'm going to label them as interpretation and response. And when you're interacting with somebody, having a conversation, seeing them, listening to them, writing to them, reading what they've written to you, you're constantly consuming their response to which then produces what you do, which produces your response, and your response then leads to their response, and you have this feedback loop that can cause problems to spiral out of control quickly. And when you start to notice that a conversation or an interaction is going off the rails, your impulse is typically to object to their response. So they respond in some way, they raise their voice, they use words that you don't like, they use body language that you find threatening. There are a bunch of things that they can do, maybe even more extreme than that. What you tend to object to is their response. And then in turn, that tends to cause you to respond in a way that's somehow objectionable, which means they object to your response, and this spirals out of control. And this leads to what I like to call the fundamental irony of interaction. The fundamental irony of interaction is this: the path from how you interpret what's going on to the way you respond. So the path from interpretation, also called significance, to response, is deeply culturally conditioned. It is rational, and it is instant. Now, what do I mean by those 3 things? Deeply culturally conditioned means that you have been taught the right way to respond in any situation since you were old enough to understand the sage advice that old people gave you. So by the time you turned 4 or 5 years old, your parents directed you, your siblings directed you, trusted authority figures directed you on the right way to behave. And not all their advice was compatible. But what this did was heap layer upon layer upon layer on this connection between how you interpret what's happening in the world and how you should respond to it, how you ought to respond to it. What is the correct way to respond to it? That's what I mean by deep cultural conditioning. It's family culture, it's regional culture, media culture, national culture. It could be religious culture, or it could be philosophical culture. All of those together have been strengthening and solidifying the path from interpretation to response. The second thing that I wanted to mention is the fact that it's instant. You choose how to respond based on the way you interpret what's happening in the world instantly. You're so good at it that you mostly respond without thinking about it. And in fact, part of the problem is that we respond without thinking about it. The whole mindfulness movement and Zen thinking is repairing the damage that comes from responding without thinking about it. And so it's instant. And for most of us, it's instant most of the time. But most importantly, and perhaps most insidiously, it's rational. And what I mean by that is that if I were in your situation, if I had your cultural conditioning, and if I interpreted the world the same way you did, or if I interpreted this situation the same way you did, I would justifiably react the same way. What that means is that by definition almost, your reaction is not wrong. Your reaction, your response is merely a function of your interpretation and your conditioning. What that means is when I object to the way you react to me, I'm objecting to the part that you have the most difficulty changing. What I should do instead, and that's the fundamental irony of interaction. The thing that I object to the most is the thing that you have the hardest time changing, which means I'm trying as hard as I can to get you to change the thing that is the hardest for you to change. No wonder it doesn't work. And so the lesson, the biggest lesson that I took from this Citerior interaction model was the idea of focusing my energy on interpretation instead of reaction. That if I find ways to help you change your interpretation, then naturally your reaction will follow, will change, and will become something significantly less objectionable. That's where ideas like the law of generous interpretation or the law of three interpretations come in. And by the way, as you apply the Citerior interaction model to your interactions with people, you will probably find yourself in the beginning trying to use it as a way to debug other people. But over time, you'll realize that really it's a way for you to debug yourself. It's a way for you to become more aware of your own tendencies, your interpretations, how you react to people. And you will find, you'll follow the old saying, that old saying, which seemed useless at the time, will actually become useful. That at the end, the only thing that you can change is yourself. All right, so now that we're coming to the end here, and don't worry, if you've asked questions, they're not going anywhere. It's just that I might not answer them now. I hope you'll join me tomorrow for that. The notion of the selfish team player is understanding that energy is your bottleneck. Literally, that's true. And taking that idea seriously. When you take bottleneck theory seriously, you focus your energy or you focus your attention on attacking the bottleneck so that you can increase the capacity of the system. In this case, that means that when you focus inward, what you're doing is not self-indulgently pampering yourself, but what you're doing is taking care of your own energy so that you can build up extra capacity, slack in energy. That slack in energy then gives you reserves that you can use to give to other people. You can use some of that for recovery, and you can use some of that to give to other people. This is where nonviolent communication comes in. The central message of nonviolent communication is that you change the way you communicate with people and the way you interact with people so that you give yourself to other people with the joy of an 8-year-old giving freely. And if you focus on being selfish, self-aware, and taking care of yourself, then it becomes much easier for you to then give yourself to the rest of the group with the joy of an 8-year-old giving freely. That is what helps you go from being merely selfish to becoming the selfish team player. And I hope you can use this in your life to become to do a better job of balancing these things and being more of a selfish team player, not only for the people that you work with, but for everybody you come in contact with. Given how crazy the world is right now, I think we could use a little bit more of it. Thanks very much for your time and attention, and thanks very much to DevConf for allowing me to do this, even though I couldn't be here with you. So I don't know whether we have any time at all to address any of these questions. Candace, how are we?
Well, I need like 1 minute, so why don't you take 2 and I'll take 1.
All right.
The rest for tomorrow.
All right. So yes, for those of you who don't get an answer to your question now, don't panic. That's what tomorrow is for. And if you can't come tomorrow, that's okay. I'll get you an answer anyway. How do I feel that TDD and the 12 XP practices correspond to Shu Ha Ri? Thanks for the question, Joshua. Essentially, I like to think of TDD. So let's talk about TDD just for a moment. I can think of at least 3 different ways of practicing TDD. The very beginning practice, which is sort of Shu level, is building the habit of writing tests as a way to gain confidence that your code behaves correctly. And for a lot of people, that already makes a big improvement. And that's really not so much test-driven development as it is the classical test-first programming that Kent Beck started to write about 25 years ago. It's crazy to say 25 years ago now, but it is what it is. At some point, making simple mistakes in your code is no longer your bottleneck. And as eventually you get to the point where your bottleneck is your ability to make change design decisions as you learn new things about how the code should be organized. And that's when you start to move towards test-driven development, and you're using it as a design technique. And by using it as a design technique, you focus on things like refactoring, which allow you to change the design of the system over time. And gradually you feel confidence that you don't need to make so many design decisions up front. And then eventually, refactoring no longer becomes your bottleneck, but your bottleneck sort of becomes balancing how careful to be in a moment. So, like I said during the body of the talk, that after a while, if you practice TDD long enough, you get to the point where you feel quite comfortable refactoring without tests, which leads you to ask the question for the first time in 10 years, when do I need to write tests? And to think about that more carefully. I mean, if we had all the resources in the world, we would just write all the tests all the time. But part of our job as professional programmers is to balance writing tests with the other value-oriented work that we do. And so eventually you get to the point where maybe your ability to balance writing tests with doing the purely value-added work becomes your bottleneck. And then you focus your energy on that. And that's where maybe something like test and commit otherwise reset, or some other form of taking tiny steps, becomes the way that you practice test-driven development. You can kind of understand this a little bit as a retelling of Shu Ha Ri. In the beginning, all you're trying to do is write tests correctly and stop shipping so many bugs. And in the middle, you're fighting a little bit with how to balance writing tests with redesigning the system, and how many design decisions can I make later and which ones do I need to make earlier. And then eventually you get to the point where in the restage, you're actually even asking the question, do I need to write tests at all? Is it okay that I'm not writing tests and the world isn't falling apart? And so to me, those things kind of match a little bit the Shu Ha Ri model, that for me, you could practice any of those practices along Shu Ha Ri. You could think of extreme programming as a whole as a bunch of novice rules for how to manage a project. Ron Jeffries always said that if you took a group of people and you locked them in a room with their consent, and you said in 2 weeks you have to ship features, you got to ship features in 2 weeks. I don't care how many, I don't care what, but it has to be shipped and it has to be done. They would have to reverse engineer something like extreme programming. All extreme programming does is provide you I shouldn't say all it does, but among the things it does, it provides you novice rules for how to improve the flow, how to improve the throughput of running tested features. So that for me is a little bit, following the rules is more like the shoe of how to deliver software. And I'm sure that was more than 2 minutes, so I will stop now. Thanks very much for not cutting me off.
That was quite a lot. I think my brain is spinning from listening to you do that. I don't know which part I like the most, but the locking people in the room with their consent really got me. Very good. So, JP, you're welcome to stay on after I'm done and chat to whoever's around. So I'll just quickly do some thank yous and close out, and then by all means stay. So it really was such an honor to have you keynote DevConf. We would have obviously loved to have met you in person, and to have met your lovely wife, Sarah, as well. And hopefully that day will still happen, maybe somewhere else in the world.
Yes, but, we'll certainly hope that at some point travel will be feasible again.
For all of us, yeah. Right throughout the planet. So just a couple of thank yous. We really would like to thank our partners, our friends at Biz Marketing, for all the logistics and for really making the event as smooth as it's been under the circumstances. The great team at Antfarm, truly remarkable the work that you do, and I think that your services are going to be in demand more and more. And Philippa and her team for managing social media today. Thank you so much for that. I don't think we would have managed. And my co-pilot Robert, who has kept me sane and I've kept him sane, and somehow as a team we just make so much sense. Thank you, thank you. Our speakers, I'm pretty sure there's 42, but if there's not 42, I'm going to keep on pretending that there are. And don't forget to rate the speakers. So devconf.co/rate. That's a great way to give them the compliments and the feedback that they thrive upon. Our sponsors, gosh, absolutely in awe of the support for the community that the sponsors have shown. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And our viewers, for all of the engagements. I know that today was a little weird and unusual, but we had so much engagement and so much conversation and collaboration on the Slack channels, on social media, even on WhatsApp. Thank you to all of you for making it what it's been. And that's all the thank yous that I have, I think. And if I've forgotten to thank somebody, then all of you that are watching, please thank them for me and Robert. And we hope that you have a wonderful evening. We are certainly going to have a couple of drinks and celebrate the day that was. It's a bring your own booze party since we're in lockdown. And thank you guys for another great DevCon. I'm out. Thanks, JB.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Cool. I'm going to leave the meeting and hopefully not end the meeting. So, bye.
Let's see what happens. All right. For anyone who is still there, please a reminder that you can go to selfish-team-player.jbrains.ca to read the notes for this talk. I can certainly try to answer these questions now quickly. But please remember that you can join me tomorrow, if I remember correctly, from 3:30 to 5 p.m. South Africa Standard Time. It will be bring your own beverage of choice, and we'll just chat for a while and we will see what happens. I can answer your questions. We can chat with each other. It's my pleasure to host you, and I hope you'll be able to join us. And if by chance you're not able to join us, then please feel free to contact me directly and ask the questions again. If I don't get an answer to you, feel free to pester me. Sometimes it takes a couple of attempts to get me to remember to answer a question, but I do eventually get to all of them. What I would like to do is to give extremely quick answers to some of these questions now in true Agile style. We'll be very incremental about it. And then for more detail, you can join us tomorrow. You would have got the details in email directly from the DevConf organizing committee. So what do burnout and depression symptoms look like? How do I know if I'm suffering? This is an extremely complicated question or a complicated answer. It literally fills bookshelves. So I can't give it justice in 30 seconds, but I can tell you one simple one little test that you can use is to pay attention to what happens when you try to rest. If you rest, pause, and you don't feel like you have recovered, then you are probably dealing with burnout and maybe even depression. There are books that include information about like questionnaires that you can answer to help you decide whether your symptoms are burnout, mild depression, medium depression, or severe. One of the most well-known is the Burns depression checklist. You can search the web and you can probably find it. You answer 25 questions and you get a score on a scale of 0 to 100. When I took that for the first time, I scored just a little bit above severe depression. Please take this seriously. And if you are able to come tomorrow, then let's chat a little bit more in more detail about that. Another question, I guess, is the same with something like website or app design. Being able to quickly see the results of your code quickly gives relief or restores energy. Absolutely. You don't have to write automated tests in order to get that bit of recovery. The equivalent of the tennis player taking a break between points while they're waiting to serve or they're waiting to receive a point is something that we can do every time we get feedback. It's one of the reasons why feedback is so important in extreme programming. And it's one of the reasons why, like, it we feel less stress when we have a better idea of what's going on. Patrick Lencioni, in his model of the 3 signs of a miserable job, has to do with measurability. If you can't measure your progress, then your job is miserable. Getting feedback about whether things work is a way of measuring how well you're doing your job. It's the same thing for, in general, if you can cut down your feedback cycle, more feedback is usually better. And in the early days of extreme programming, one of the books Extreme Programming Explored included a chapter title called A Sense of Completion. That was one of the centerpieces of extreme programming, or any incremental or spiral approach to software development. Part of what makes it work is that knowledge workers in software have a tendency not to get enough of a sense of completion, and more incremental work is a way of getting that sense of completion more in your work. How do I maintain being a selfish team player if the project has poor organization and planning, plus a really tight deadline in an environment that is close to being toxic? Akil, I hope you can join us tomorrow. But if you can't, in short, the shortest answer I can give you is you maintain being a selfish team player out of it is essentially a defense mechanism. I would tip towards selfish at that point and away from team player, in part because the alternative is that one day you flip a table and storm out. If you are going to reduce your capacity by, say, reining in what you do and paying more attention to caring for yourself, it might be better for you to give 60% of yourself to the rest of the organization than to just quit, than to wait until that panic moment where you quit. So, not that I'm counseling anybody to quit a job, but it is worth understanding that being ready to leave a job without being eager to leave that job yet is an extremely powerful position to be in. That's something that I hope we get a chance to talk about in some detail tomorrow. So Akil, I hope that helped. And if it didn't, then please join us tomorrow, and I hope I can help you more. I mentioned making simple mistakes is no longer, when making simple mistakes is no longer the bottleneck. Did I ever read PSP, TSP? No, I never did. I don't know if I missed anything, but it doesn't surprise me that the idea of, when I say making simple mistakes is no longer the bottleneck, I don't mean it in the Six Sigma drive out variation kind of way. I more mean it in we use feedback. The feedback we get when we do something comes so quickly that after a while, we can anticipate our mistakes before we make them. And whatever mistakes we make, we discover them so quickly that it's even difficult to call them mistakes anymore. One of the neat things that happens after you work that incremental way long enough is you stop thinking about those things as mistakes and you just start thinking of them as feedback. So, and that takes away a lot of the emotional content out of it too. It takes away the negative emotional content out. If you start to think of your work as more experiments and results, and then adapting your technique based on the results of the experiments, then you can work in a much, even if you don't work in a positive way, you certainly work in a less negative way, perhaps more neutral, where the emotional content is more positive and less distracting, and that allows you to sustain more energy and use that to do more work. And finally, do I have a YouTube channel? I do. My YouTube channel I do have 2 YouTube channels, one that I don't post to anymore, one that I do. My YouTube ID is jbrains762, so that's JBRAINS 762. So you can find me on YouTube. I don't post a lot of stuff there, and a lot of the stuff that I post there is not software development stuff, but instead 5-pin bowling. And if you don't know what 5-pin bowling is, don't worry, you will. But given the realities of our current situation, I imagine that everybody is going to be posting to YouTube more over the coming months, and I suspect I will be no different. So if you have requests for content, if you want to ask me questions, that's how consultants work. We feed on your questions so that we generate content. So feel free to ask, and then maybe there'll be an answer coming to a YouTube video near you. All right. Thanks very much, everyone. I'll be back I'm going to go grab something to drink, come back and hang out for a little bit. And then for the rest of it, I hope to see as many of you as we can tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. South Africa Standard Time. Thanks very much and take care.